Hello everyone, today we complete our 13th century Florentine history chapter for our historical regional series. We began a couple of days ago the century, covering the first half and observing the rising power of Florence as a veritable city-state. Now, amidst the unavoidable as ferocious clashes between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. After the Battle of Figline, the Guelphs managed to essentially shake themselves off the seigneury of Frederick of Antioch, the natural son Frederick II. And so there is this phase before the Battle of Montaperti that we covered last summer in a dedicated video. The Guelph hegemony will remain in the city, but still with a strong Ghibelline presence, and especially a quite effervescent international scenario. We enter in the age of Manfred of Swabia, the other natural son of Frederick II that managed to succeed, albeit unlawfully, as King of Sicily. After his father, in lieu of his nephew, actually first of his brother Conrad IV, king of the Romans, and then after the death of this in a military campaign, in fact in southern Italy, he had descended there. The young Conradin of Swabia. I made a video about the Battle of Tagliacozzo recently as well, so if you're interested in that context, you know that there is plenty of stuff. Like there is a playlist for the Holy Roman Empire, for southern Italy, for Guelphs and Ghibellines, for the Hohenstaufen. Like there's really a lot into that. And actually, Florence was pretty much at the center of this. There is a radicalization of the Guelph-Ghibelline international struggle exactly under Manfred, right? Even more than under Frederick II. And Tuscany is becoming ever more central to this broader policy, as much as Florence was, given that she was essentially rising, as she hadn't really been that up to some time before this, the greatest city in Tuscany. And in fact, this video is pretty dense. Like you can argue that the second half of the 13th century is literally the peak of the Florentine might, if anything, in a relative sense, considering that this is the most tumultuous phase of growth for the commune, amidst some of also the most glorious pages of an otherwise pretty painful Florentine military history. This will be particularly evident when we will cover especially the first half of the 14th century, but you know that also in the rest of the Middle Ages, compared to other Italian powers, Florence was always sort of, not even sort of reactionary. We'll see how there is, especially in the early 14th century, and already from the end of the 13th, actually a very big deal of Florentine military updateness, let's say, and so a picture that often contrasts like with the age of, say, John Oakwood and the Condotta and Machiavelli's sort of attempt to stimulate some sort of Florentine saddle army of some sort in the Renaissance, for which we think that the Florentines mostly didn't want just to pay too much for war. They did not want to arm mostly their peasantry, not even their citizenry, telling the truth, but they needed the former to begin with. And we tend to sort of mimify that as if that was all the story. No, actually, in the late 13th century, Florence was capable of fielding, and further, like in the beginning of the 14th, actually amongst the largest armies in Italy, together with Milan. We're talking 30,000 men, right? So we're talking the largest forces in Europe, as a matter of fact, together with the ones of the French kingdom, This is something I insist extremely on because there is a sort of historiographical gap. I will not start digressing on that. That has basically obscured this otherwise incredibly brilliant and pretty large and very, very like most large-scale reality in also one of the most, in fact, developed areas, and actually also the single most documented one in parallel, which is also no coincidence, and that makes this this forgetfulness, let's put it in this way, ever more curious and weird, to say the least, but I will not discuss it in this video. We witnessed from the previous generations the growing importance of the arts, that is to say, the guilds, the corporations that were essentially to dominate Florentine politics together with the nobility and other elements of the populace especially, that altogether was fueling, in fact, distrust towards the second element, the nobility, the aristocratic estate, if you want. I don't have to digress yet again in this series, like what is nobility in communal Italy. It's mostly a matter of census, together with also some intertwinement with previous feudal origin, etc. But we will have to make other videos specifically on it to explain better how it worked. They were pretty much like the equivalent of the feudal elite in other parts of Europe. What is fascinating about this is that the process of Florentine state building, we've seen it in the previous videos, passes through the internal pacification of the city, right? The essentially deterrent capacity to stop with this major clans, essentially mafios lifestyle based on honor, violence, not forgiving anything, like being always up to a fight and attempting especially to the seigneury of the city. We've seen how the popolo has been formed as an actual paramilitary, but not properly military corps, right, that is designed to counter, in fact, the knights in the narrow city streets, in the major squares of the city. There is a mounting force in Florence that is becoming essentially the literally richest city in the entire globe, which is manifest, in fact, even in the infantry capacity. The specialization was actually happening pretty much everywhere in Italy at this point, and corresponding to the general developments of the medieval art of war at that time. It reaches the peak, especially in terms of arms in integration, like synergy, like of the various forces. At the top with pikemen, policemen, crossbowmen, and other, like, I don't know, like for example, pole arms, some sort of double-handed axes, and more. We'll talk, if anything, more about that in the historical military unit series for the Italian communal infantry. Also, the interesting aspect about this anti-magnate, because this was the actual term used to check the most powerful noblemen, is that this was aimed at both, containing the power of both the Guelf and the Ghibelline magnates, that at the same time were not really ostracized as a group. Some would be exiled, some of their towers would be destroyed in the city, and they would be persecuted by the commune, but the commune was still held by other magnates, together with the guild, the system, the populace, etc. And so it's all sort of much more vertical than sort of horizontal divide. Now, although the Florentine populace remained loyal to the papacy during this time of Guelph orientation, we can't even say regime fully, because again there were both Guelphs and Ghibellines, as we just pointed out in the case of the magnates. It was true also for the rest of the system, even though tendentially the populace was more Guelph, and the magnates tended, at least in part, to be more Ghibelline. And this is the reason why, after the death of the Stupor Mundi, Florence distanced herself from Manfred of Swabia. in southern Italy. And again, remember that there were all other Tuscan cities at this point. This is still a moment in the history of central northern Italy in which you have this 30 city-states that are basically independent from one another, right? They all have a government on its own, and it's just in the early 14th century that these cities basically start controlling one another. For Lombardy, it's true. Milan has already extended its de facto control over other communes, but it's not like a full conquest, if not in some exceptional cases, because also what is a commune, right? We talk about approximately 30 cities, but there were actually more, like, hundreds and more of other communes, of villages, etc. There are, as we've seen, pretty aggressive Ghibelline forces in Tuscany, Pisa, Arezzo, and the same Siena, right? And so Florence at this point is becoming the most powerful city, where most of the international trade passes, but in fact the local production also expanding to meet the demand. As we'll see now, especially the textile industry was growing. But there are all these territories around to contend these other communes that also are aiming fundamentally at conquering one another. And Florence does exactly the same. During these years, a significant campaign took place to demolish the towers of those magnates that were considered like a threat to the Republic at this point. This was seen as both a public order initiative and a morally symbolic gesture as well to discipline whoever was to attempt anything shady. Again, I will surely make other videos to explain better what the anti-magnate legislation is. Not just in Florence, this was happening at different times, but more or less like the same era in the other Italian communes. Some were much more sort of seigneurial in nature, others were, said much more, in fact, republican, Florence being properly the peak of the latter aspect. I don't know, there were places like Ferrara that always had a dynasty, never had a problem with that. But overall, there is always this need of regulating the greater power of this essentially higher nobility living in the city that had really the capacity of taking over. In 1255, importantly, the Palazzo del Popolo was constructed, right? So this is the most sort of significant power display of this, as we've seen, political organization. The Popolo Palace is what would later become known, famously enough, as the Bargello. The Bargello was the name of essentially the head of the police that the Popolo expressed, and that was provided with those paramilitary forces we're talking about before. I had to literally go pick the disobedience, right? And there are often urban battles in this process with different, of course, factions all across the cities participating depending on their political alignment. But what is important, we will see it later also for the general sort of art and architectural development of Florence that is already quite pronounced by this time, is the fact that palaces are being built. This is the same age in which prisons are built. Like properly in the West at this point, it wasn't something like, okay, we will simply, imprison people and keep them there, right? Normally they were either killed or, if not, they were, say, held for a short time in custody somewhere. But the notion of having like a public authority that is able to inflict like important penalties and to maintain just with force, right? That kind of public regulation is something relatively new, right? The same stone buildings like the Bargello and other palaces like the house towers we described before as massive skyscrapers dominating the Italian communal skyline are really the material manifestation of this insane power that was being concentrated within the city's gates. So in this period, we see essentially a decade of conquest including the capture of Volterra in 1254. This is quite interesting, because Florence will actually maintain throughout her history more like a confederal form of government, right? The Milanese, for example, we were saying it before, would create some sort of veritable state of some sort. Like, it is true that the communes were technically always free. There wasn't like such thing like an absolute state that could simply say, okay, now, I don't know, I'm Milan, and I transform neighboring Bergamo into a Milanese city, another copy of Milan. This is a medieval, right, pre-statal, say, at least in a broader, say, contemporary sense, system by which there is mostly like a form of seigneury, right? And Lombardy is much more seigneurially oriented from an earlier age. Tuscany instead is the cradle of republicanism. And even though this is definitely the case in comparison to the two areas, the fact that the communes are doing the same thing. Florence literally conquers Volterra, that would maintain some important autonomy, and in fact would rather, aside from the military details now we can sort of digress on, and why Volterra was captured, given the infiltration of opponents into the respective contado, like the comitatus district, from which in turn, like, other, say, the enemies of the cities could infest each other's countryside from. It's rather the Florentine financial hegemony that manages to absorb these smaller communes in Tuscany. Volterra, San Gimignano, San Miniato, these are all quite interesting. Like, there are actual little, masterpieces, veritable treasures, like some sort of time machines. As you know, they're sort of among the most medieval things ever, right? And also to a degree the preservation of those house towers that instead were of course surpassed in the other bigger centers, for us not to see much more left of it. There is stuff like that. Bologna is very famously provided with these. Even Rome has it. The militia towers is pretty just behind the imperial fora. Also, as a testament to the not just of the heavy militarization of the city at the time, the fortifications that were everywhere and so on, but the fact that it was a medieval world, even in a city like Rome that we mostly appreciate for, of course, like the outer classical and Renaissance vestiges, and that, however, was at some point a massively fortified medieval city, and that we tend to forget for all these centers. Naturally, the subjugation of Volterra in this area, mostly contended with Siena, enhanced the overall strength of the Florentine commune. This was notably demonstrated by the introduction, during the same period, of the famous florin, the gold florin, into the international financial market during those years. Right, Florence is one of the, again, it's most reliable states in Europe. As such, it's also, as we've seen, extremely wealthy, and so the Florentine florin is basically the basis for most other, for essentially the Italian currency, and also importantly the international one at the time, especially in the bigger exchanges, in the ones connected with the Italian banking system we discussed in other videos. Now, the decade known as the First Popolo, the Primo Popolo, so the one followed to the specific constitution at the beginning of the 13th century that affirmed like the prerogatives of this popular association, plus the one of the guilds and the aristocracy, etc. So an extraordinary flourishing of the city, supported by, we just said, its own gold currency, the florin. Remember that gold was, and still is, technically the gold standard, not just in a financial sense, but also in a metaphysical one. Right, the golden age, the matter of the gods, right, and the most direct reflection of public, independent authority. This at a point had been regulated, like the mint's rights, for example, were normally chartered to various towns across Europe. Normally, we hear it connected with, in fact, monarchies, right? In Italy, technically, there is a kingdom, but there is no monarchy, at least in the central northern part. That is also the one part of the, say, of the Holy Roman Empire. So in theory, there are actually some contracts and recognitions of this public right recognized by the same empire. But in many ways, the fact that these cities, especially now after the death of Frederick II, and so the general crisis of the Germanic Empire, are ever more evidently as virtually independent city-states that are also creating their own territories and running them as we've seen to the level of power of individual countries out there. Introduced in 1252, it was the florin, right, was the first gold coin in Western Europe proper, right, in the systematically, revitalized and sort of conventionally recognized fashion. It was, you can understand the prestige of Florence, that it's not even a regional state at this point. It's actually had, again, still confined in a provincial context that has to contest other rising powers. This florin was characterized by its remarkably stable weight and alloy. Remember, Florence is growing that much without having an access to the sea. Everything is done by, proxies, by branches, by agents, and this tells you alone what kind of pull the system already had at the time. The Florentine proverb "San Giovanni un vuole inganni," that is to say, literally, Saint John does not want tricks, fundamentally, reflects the assurance of quality provided by the image of Saint John the Baptist, that, as you know, was among the protectors of Florence, on the same gold florin, which facilitated its widespread adoption across Europe and the Mediterranean as a currency for significant transactions, major payments, and international loans. At this point, as you know, many Tuscan bankers, we were seeing it recently in the video about Edward I, are subsidizing the largest monarchies in Europe, England, France, etc. But going back to the Italian situation, the rise of Manfred of Swabia was a huge deal. I made a video about this guy. Nobody talks about him, but he was veritably one of the greatest rulers in medieval history. We talked about Ezzelino da Romano, the Veronese signore, lord, that Frederick II had co-opted, albeit originally at Guelf, right, for controlling, in fact, as an imperial vicar, the Adige Valley, in the so-called Trevisan Mark, in northeastern Italy, right. This guy had been really a very effective ruler, and especially because of a later author, famous Paduan chronicler Albertinus Mussatus, the beginning of the 14th century. There is all a dark legend about him for many reasons. Like, he was, again, a Ghibelline and a Veronese that fought and won against the Paduans that were instead traditionally more. They were a bit like the Florence of northeastern Italy. Like, they were Guelph, they were more republican. And we come to even dramatize these figures, but Ezzelino's death in battle indeed had a major effect in the rebalancement of Italy, that at that point was also pretty much still a battleground politically for the papacy to win over, in fact, the Ghibellines, that regardless of the fall of the, say, at least the Swabian Empire, let's call it in this way, still received substantial support, as we've seen from Manfred of Sicily. It had even, of course, ties with Germany. So this second half of the 13th century definitely reflects how international the struggle was, right? The rise of Manfred with especially this loss of northeastern Italy after Ezzelino's death brought to a greater Ghibelline investment in Tuscany. Siena was the most important, continental center in the region after Florence. And definitely there were economic competitors because more or less they did the same thing. Again, there were bankers and textile producers, and then again they had this stadal armies that began to seriously challenge the territorial integrity of the respective dominions. Then you have Pisa, that is a maritime republic, but is open to the hinterland, differently from, say, Venice with the lagoons or Genoa with the mountains. So the situation is really effervescent. There are all the various Ghibelline exiles from different centers, including the same Florentine ones that want to come back to their city, and so they are infesting, as we were saying before, the Florentine countryside, backed by their sponsors, their supporters, Sicily or these other Ghibelline centers, etc. So this clash reached, as we've seen in the video about the Battle of Montaperti, a pivotal moment on that fatal September the 4th, 1260, which shows really the capacities of both contendants. Florence fields an army of 30,000 men, and actually the Battle of Montaperti is the only one that provides us with the actual and only source for all medieval history about the actual size of a real medieval army from the records of the same that were preserved as part of the general, administrative material that fell into the Siennese hands from the Florentine camp, and that the Florentines, when they would conquer Siena in the Renaissance, in the age of humanism, would bring back in treasure as a prize. Of course, like we won back anyway what was lost at some point, and of course, lots of water had passed under the bridges, including Siena and Florence win strong friends at that point. And from the Siennese side, we see essentially a similar force backed by hundreds of German mercenaries sent by Manfred of Sicily, because mostly the southern Italian power at this point was not constituted by the old feudal levy anymore, but essentially by mercenaries, and there were lots of Germans that were connected with the Hohenstaufen to be still in Sicily, where they had been attracted from because of the great courts, etc. Then there would be a shift actually when the Angevins will conquer southern Italy, so that lots of German mercenaries start fighting instead in northern Italy for the local Ghibellines. We will see it better, especially after the expedition of Henry VII, but that's for the 14th century video. Now, Montaperti really was a devastating defeat, right? It was said that the stream Arbius waters, right, running by the battlefield, were dyed in red because of the massive slaughter of this huge army. And you think 30,000 men. I thought medieval armies were small. They weren't small at all. First of all, this was also kind of normal, right? We not just about this region of Europe. We have like an overwhelming documentation for objectivizing the real size of these armies, given the bureaucracy and administration of the states, the enormous costs they could support. But in fact, we know that this was, say, a regular eventuality, that normally these powers were able to field armies of tens of thousands of men, and were single cities. And you still find videos on YouTube inexplicably whining about things like, but we have just, the medieval armies were small. Look at this single evidence that I found here. Oh my God, if this was, I don't know, the English army at the Battle of Crecy was small. There were other times in which the English armies were actually much larger than the one of Crecy. It's just the fact that you can't even search for sort of basic secondary sources, secondary text references, and don't have a comprehensive understanding of medieval warfare shouldn't legitimize you to spread misinformation about also very well-known episodes, like in fact the one of Montaperti, studied in every country from centuries, since it happened basically. And so that reveals the deep ignorance and cultural inferiority of today's, in fact, subcultural, I don't know even how to say it, average pop pseudo-historical notions. In any case, Montaperti is a huge deal in Florentine history because not just it's such a burning defeat, but it brings to the re-establishment at this point of the Ghibelline regime. Right? If you're interested in the details about the battle, some really reveal how much of a civil war this also was. Right? I will not digress on them, but notoriously, whereas we've seen troops of the different citizenry fighting from both sides, they were also basically the same people. These are Tuscans. At large, they are the same people. They speak the same language. They have the same lifestyle, the same customs, but they're able to slaughter themselves on a regular basis, which is definitely the proof of how radically remunerative it was to be based and to invest right on this single city-state, even right, some tens of kilometers distant from one another only. There is a critical moment during the battle in which the standard bearer of the Florentine army has his arm cut off by another, like a fellow Florentine, at least fighting under the Guelphs, that, however, betrayed to support the Ghibellines, and so everything is, of course, very political in this regard. So, notoriously, after the battle, the Ghibellines regained control of Florence. It's all very sudden, right? Imagine the news of the battle spreading far and wide. Another myth about medieval history is that news took so much time to track. No, right? If people were interested in receiving that information, this would travel at most for some weeks across the entire continent. And especially like in this area of Tuscany, it was all fought over the Via Francigena. We're talking about very well infrastructurally served areas. Like it was immediate, like in the span of a day. Of course, they knew this, right? And so simply, like the strength ratio would be that altered by this major bloodbath. We've seen it also on other occasions before this with Battle of Figline that we were remembering before. So that the Guelphs are expelled, they escape. Normally the men fled, and the women and the children were normally spared. They could keep living in their quarters, but of course the great part of the wealth would be subtracted. Sometimes instead, probably everybody was expelled, and the house towers razed. Right, and the sense, as we have explained also in many more in-depth videos, was of course that in the countryside were lots of castles still occupied by these noble houses that couldn't quite be simply dislodged, because at least each of these places that now were starting just like these massive palaces in the cities would be also much bulkier in a military engineering sense, were difficult to besiege, to conquer. We had to go one by one. We'll see it now, for example, with the Battle of Campaldino, the siege of Poppi, and the one, I'd say that in order to enter into a territory, there, of course, like in this case, it's again the political balance that has structures falling immediately into somebody else's hands, right? Needless to say, after Montaperti, the Ghibellines initiate a series of reprisals that include exile, property confiscation, and destruction of homes belonging to the Guelphs in Florence. However, when Manfred's vicar in Tuscany, at the Diet of Empoli, proposed, we're in 1264, right, to completely destroy the city of Florence, much like Frederick I had done with Milan a century earlier, except the Milanese rebuilt it from scratch in a very short time during those same years. The staunch opposition of, and of course it wasn't like razed all to the ground, otherwise we wouldn't have all the ancient or older monuments of Milan, but it was, say, neutralized. Normally the walls were raised, there would be a general devastation at Similia, but you can't eradicate in the 13th century, a massively built and stratified settlement, like cities of Roman foundation, the centers of the district. It's impossible, technically speaking. But in this occasion, of course, Florence would have been wiped out in a political sense. And it was very much a Ghibelline interest to, let's say, in this case, a broader Ghibelline interest to do so, given the power of the city. But this decision found the staunch opposition of Farinata degli Uberti. This is a famously described episode also in Dante's Inferno, that preserved the Florentine integrity. Right, Dante tells us the whole story that even though he was namely at least a Guelph, in reality he was a Ghibelline, but in this previous generation, the Ghibellines had been eventually re-ousted by the Guelphs, and so more or less, Dante was a so-called white Guelph, so it would turn out, especially in exile, to be a veritable Ghibelline, as essentially the Angevins marched into the city at some point. He was expelled, and so Farinata was still an enemy, right? Dante was from essentially a smaller nobility of Florence, a knight, etc. We will see this now better because we approach also his lifetime here. And Farinata is such an epic figure in the entire system because it was the great Ghibelline lord, right? Italians cared incredibly about the sense of, higher chivalric knightly power, nobility, like in a truly traditional imperial sense. The true name of Farinata was Manente, right? Just like Dante's real name was actually Durante, right? And these are they're typically Ghibelline names, typically traditional, perennialist names. Manente, manens, or maneo, that is to remain, right? Dante, Durante, it means something enduring, right? This is the etymology. So this talks of the doctrine of the two natures that we discussed in some history of religion video about this man being born to be of the higher kind, of a spiritual divine power that had to be won in arms, right? And there is a racial component to this very much. Farinata is not the only one. There are other great leaders of the time that were blonde and blue-eyed. I don't know, Matteo Visconti, Castruccio, Cangrande as well. These were all this sort of incarnation of Indo-European values. Farinata is a nickname. Farina, as you know, in Italian means floor, and it referred to the blonde platinum hair, so the almost white hair of Farinata. It was that sort of fair-looking, as the famous Corso Donati, by the way, the famous so-called Catilina of Florence that tried a coup, right? Magnate trying a coup, the ones that were really feared by the anti-magnate legislation. So it is really soaked in that sort of hardcore traditional chivalric mentality that we should really rewire our brains to through while thinking history and I'd say like this alleged centers of simply mercantile republicanism that actually were just pieces of Holy Roman Imperial Catholic Apostolic power in the truest Roman meaning sense of each term. Manente lives up to the expectations because he basically admonishes the other Ghibelline leaders at the Council of Empoli and says, this is my city. I'm not going to let you destroy it. Come fight me if you really dare. You can imagine like the tensions. Again, this knightly individuality was still extremely looked up to it, so that even a political enemy, right, Farinata could admire him so much. Right, he places him in hell, but still, he's an epic, figure. That also, of course, highlights how you can be such a great man and sort of be wrong. That's the meaning of the story in many ways, because it's not like Dante had known these individuals really. In this case, at least, it's the prior generation of Florentine politics, but of course he was such a hero and such a huge figure because he had saved the same city. But still, he was punished. So it's a deep moral teaching at many levels. consider that we've seen it a bit better in the previous video about, say, the videos about the first half of the 13th century. Farinata was placed in hell because of the heresy allegations, right, that he had been accused of, due to the fact that it was said that the Ghibellines were essentially fighting against the church in general. And it seems that, in fact, the Cathars of Florence had been weaponized, as actually some Fourth Estate radicals had nothing to do with the Ghibelline tradition. It was ultra-Catholic, to the very metaphysical sense of the term, in its purest Romanity, as we've seen with Farinata, probably even at a racial level. Just to counter, like, say, you've seen how complex Florentine politics and society really is. So there were so many different groups. And Farinata's corpse, like together with the one of his family, later, when the Guelphs came back in charge, because they had already died, was essentially thrown out of his tomb. Its remains dispersed. It's kind of a blind fury, this Dionysian element, mostly of the popular Guelph one, at least to that level of the people of the rabble. Not like the higher nobility for that matter. That was also like a matter of convenience, but shows also how, by the way, through what we know about Farinata's, the Ubertis sepulchre, where otherwise we think extremely Orthodox Catholics, right? So, it's just like the integrity of this man we can't even properly begin to understand, because this is really, as you understand, a very well documented time in history. Like, we don't have the stories about, Poland during the same time, for obvious reasons, but it's still like almost fairy tale like moment. And this is true for Europe as a whole, because this is the peak of universalism, of chivalry, feudalism, but of course true at the pen of Dante. We leave this immense privilege of picturing such details that otherwise, we do not know for the general times, and sometimes even places, right, if it's not documented in such level of depth and poetry, especially in this case. Now, during this period of Ghibelline dominance, when Florence's history appeared to regress, at least from a communal perspective, because remember, the Ghibellines were hoping, in this sense, to be co-opted by the major feudal powers. In this case, Manfred was pursuing really a Mediterranean-wide imperial policy. Dante himself, Dante Alighieri, the veritable name, I made an entire series on Dante for the anniversary of his, 700th anniversary of his death in 2021, was Durante di Altichiero degli Altichieri. Right, this was the actual name. Was baptized at the font of St. John, right? Even as the exile of what would become his faction persisted. So you understand under which signs, even just a great figure like Dante, the voice of medieval civilization, was born. This is so extremely meaningful. So imagine, what was going on politically speaking when you were born. You're still very familiar with, in general, you can feel it. You can feel it in your parents. You can feel it as a general cultural temper of your times, right? It's so close, so present to a degree. Now, in 1263, Pope Urban IV, intent on dethroning Manfred in favor of Charles of Anjou, we explained this fairly well in the video about not just Charles of Anjou himself, but also the one about the Battle of Tagliacozzo, excommunicated the Ghibellines of Florence and Siena. This had naturally serious implications, because first of all, you were truly excommunicated, in the sense you could not be communicated, and so you could die in your sin and go to hell as a consequence. But there were also very, very practical problems also during these people's lives, because under the interdict, every good Christian was absolved from repaying debts to those who had been excommunicated. So, for especially such an important financial center like these Tuscan cities were becoming, it was an incredibly huge deal. Major commercial enterprises hastened to align themselves with the Holy See in exchange for a document that permitted them to reclaim their credits. In fact, what is really fascinating at this point is, we will see it in another videos, how the Guelph exiles of Florence will become the ones who will be subcontracted with the monopoly for the exports of especially the Sicilian grain for the actual investment, the actual money provided to the Pope and to Charles of Anjou to carry out the crusade against Manfred, that, as you know, was defeated at the Battle of Benevent in February 1266. This is really relevant because there are lots of Italian Guelphs among the troops of Charles of Anjou. This experience is really important also for the art of war, because eventually the Italian communes will develop a hell of a military tactics that it was essentially the full completion of the feudal one that now was coupled, in fact, with massive infantry wings that likely were there, but not to the degree that the Italian communes really use it. So it's sort of a bit like the pinnacle of arms and arm combination, even, you know, compared to an important extent of still of early modern warfare, right? This is Benevent is one of these major battles. By the way, Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld are essentially the largest battles of the period, right? The largest feudal battles ever fought. Markfeld, I think, properly in absolute terms, the largest one of knights involved. We're talking about massive engagements, and the exile Guelph knights earned such a great experience in these clashes. You can understand the hatred we were talking about before among these partes, as they called them, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, in battles like Benevent, like taking action against the Ghibellines, right? The sponsors of the same Florentine Ghibellines who were ruling in Tuscany at that point were, of course, supporting Manfred. Naturally, with the death of Manfred, the Angevin victory at Benevent and the conquest of the Kingdom of Sicily by the French, that recompensated immediately these Guelphs for their services, the Ghibellines were expelled from Florence, and in hindsight, for good, right? This Florence is essentially a Guelph city historically, because we mostly see it peaking, of course, in the time of the greatest time of the Italian this generations, right, of Giotto, of the financiary, the absolute wealth that Florence managed to accumulate, the Italian Trecentals in art, like the Toscan, Angevin, Provençal connection. It's really huge, right, in terms of state building, bureaucracy, military expansion. I made a video recently about the armies of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in the second half of the 13th century. They really start becoming immense. And this is also the moment, in fact, in which the Florentine-Neapolitan alliance is established. Many Tuscan merchants began to actively rule the administration of the massive Neapolitan kingdom. Is a huge landmass, incredibly fertile, populated, etc. You know that also later on with Queen Jeanne, there's the story that she was the lover of the Acciaiuoli, that was, you know, the guy who ruled the southern Italy. There are so many, at least in an economic sense, there's so many connections. Think about Boccaccio's novels in the times he was in Naples because of the banking experience he had before the financial crack of the the early 14th century. So much European culture, civilization, literature, and broader, let's say, history passes through this connection. That, as far as I'm interested, especially very beautiful to study from a military point of view. There's so much connection. In fact, I'm doubting that I will be able to arrive to the end of the 13th century for this video. I will try, but I can't promise that. So a new age starts really with the, yet again, wealth regime of Florence. A government that increasingly aligned with, in fact, the Papal, the Angevin, the French route. You have, of course, also a general cooperation between the Popolo and the Guelf part, even though these remained distinct entities. In fact, it wasn't even technically a Guelf party properly meant. This was just a sort of a political orientation. All right. And it had also broader international implications, as we said. The Popolo was mostly like the representation of this more popular element of the citizenry, which is not to be confused with sort of the average fourth estate or immigrant that was working in this in the city during the day in the great textile industries and sleeping in the suburbs outside the gates at night. That, however, would be used as a soldier in case of, when they were called for the army and so on. There is a lot of warfare, as we will understand now, and a lot of things going on in the development of the Florentine state and the Italian communes in general. This is a very glorious phase that the Angevins take also very seriously. I talked about the so-called Pax Angevins, and so the idea that after Benevent, that we will see now after Tagliacozzo, and there are also for Tuscany specifically very important reaffirmations, probably of wealth power through Florentine victories. Florence enters this sort of safeguarded net, of which she becomes really the main logistical hub, meaning that basically all the Guelphs of central and part of northern Italy revolve around Florence, also because of her strategic position on the road to France and the Apennine passes between Emilia and Tuscany, in fact, etc. Also because it's just a large city, it's very well connected on the Arno and everything. It will become a major place, a fairly sheltered and sort of safe one to gather troops. There is the Taglia, the Guelph Taglia Tuscany. It is basically a collectaneous agreement in which the various subscribing cities contribute with money to maintain a semi-permanent army of even tens of thousands of men. Different troops specialize in different ways. Most of these guys start being French, right? Because there are lots of French adventurers that come to be hired as mercenaries in Italy, especially as Charles of Anjou affirms himself. Charles of Anjou becomes a Roman senator, for example. The reason why he shifted, for example, his capital from the traditional, say, Swabian centers of Sicily or Apulia into Naples is also to stay much closer to Rome, and having this papal toxic relations. In fact, the Pope at some point, yes, it's happy that the Hohenstaufen are taken out, but it's not like the Angevins were particularly, relaxing to say the least. And Charles of Anjou becomes also Podestà of Florence, which, as we explained in the previous video of this series, of course, was a pretty strong position. Regardless of the immense power that the Angevins have, they tend to actually go pretty easy in terms of on this Tuscan. It's in general Guelph cities in Italy, because this Angevin hegemony extends also in parts of the north, where also the greatest Ghibelline sacks of resistance had been maintained. Also in Tuscany, I mean, they were everywhere, but overall, right, especially with Florence, and especially the various regime changes that occurred in part because of the same Battle of Benevent, also in other cities. Of course, this was a relatively homogeneously, say, politically aligned region. Does not go so heavy on that. I mean, the cities pay some money for the Angevins to send some troops, like mostly French Neapolitan provincial knights sometimes. This is a bit later, after the peace of the Treaty of Caltabellotta that put an end to the Vespers Wars. There are also some Catalan mercenaries that actually had come from Spain to fight the French in southern Italy, but that after the war do not find employers, and they're hired by the same Angevins of Naples that send them as also fairly contained. We're talking again few hundred men as a garrison to the various Guelph cities out there. It's interesting that this kind of troop, albeit very successful, as you know, in Greece, in Turkey, will not spark for particular effectiveness in Italy, that actually asks ever more for heavier cavalry. So always put things in perspective when you think about, again, infantry being the future, this deterministic growth of infantry as the technology, modernity. It's a complete load of BS to a major degree, right? The single most advanced military area here has not just the top infantries that do not surpass cavalry, even though they are in absolute terms the strongest in Europe, because guess what? They were actually a civilization. They did not need to oppose them to cavalry. It was pretty heavy, and so they ask actually it to be, the top kind of this French-German mercenaries that come to flow in this very rich place from the general crisis, also knighthood, north of the Alps. So it's incredibly interesting to see how non-obvious at all, still, even our own knowledge of the common narrative medieval warfare really is. Charles of Anjou, as Podesta of Florence, becomes even papal vicar in Tuscany. Vicariates are very important. The Pope normally sends legates when they made a video about the papal legacies. At this point, mostly for the 11th to 12th century, the Gregorian reforms, and they're still here at the moment, but they have turned into some sort of kind of generals, right? So it's quite interesting because inside the imperial vicars were exactly the same from the Ghibelline side. And so this is the moment in which these titles are even formalizing further. For example, the papal vicariate in Tuscany with Charles of Anjou begins in 1267. There are pro forma issues. Like, it's not like that Florence was literally governed by the Angevins, nor any other city. They were simply supported, sponsored, like backed up, and sort of cooperating with them. This is again incredibly important because you would think the Angevins also to be the bad guys, especially if you're fixated with Ghibellinism, tradition, and whatever, like I am. But actually, their government was pretty light, right? It wasn't so oppressive like the actual imperial chancellors had been. This is quite interesting. I mean, the Germans were more heavy-handed. They tend to think that they had to re-opt everything into some sort of, however, feudal autocracy, as we've seen with the same Ghibellines. And this was just because of the wars of the Lombard League. So the time up to the time of Frederick II, really not possible. It was evident at this point. It was sort of a lost battle. The Angevins are more aware of this, generally speaking, if anything, because they had come to Italy with sort of greater conditions, especially dictated by the Pope, that was sponsoring their crusading effort. And again, yes, the Angevins would also exceed in their power. That there were some, but especially in central and northern Italy, there wasn't even that territorial continuum of power that would allow the Angevins to say simply, okay, we will conquer this place. No, right? The Neapolitan kingdom remains there. These cities remained on their side. So everything is mostly a matter of broader coordination. In fact, it's also an incredibly florid time, right? There are very interesting studies showing that in terms of financial wealth, like things started going insanely well. This is also because, in fact, the wars against the Hohenstaufen are over. So this doesn't happen just to the Guelphs, but it happens under a Guelph hegemony at large that is characterized by this lack of effort to conquest. Like the Angevins weren't trying to conquer, to subjugate heavy-handedly this entire system. They were not particularly distant from that, but they still were there on other terms, right? And this is very important to stress, and we'll explain also better why when we'll make more Angevin history. In any case, you can see from this Italian communal perspective that this order was, generally speaking, stabilizing things a great deal. By the way, Charles of Anjou's formal rule in Tuscany lasted for a decade. And it's not like because the guy died afterwards, it's, he continued, but this was just a way to affirm that now things had changed. And as you know, the Ghibellines were remaining without much of great help, because these are the years of the Great Interregnum. It's not until the rise of Rudolf of Habsburg that things that wasn't very far away, admittedly, but that wouldn't, for example, bring to any Italian expedition from Germany. You have to wait really 1311, 1312 for Henry VII, so the actual return of Germanic presence, at least of imperial authority at that point, into the peninsula. All right. In foreign policy and in reshaping the Guelph organization, the ancient banner was raised once more with unwavering commitment and strong alliances against any remaining opposition to Florentine hegemony in a broader sense. This was yet far away from being achieved in Tuscany, but you have, for example, the Battle of Colle in the Elsa Valley, where in 1267, which was a pretty heavy Sienese defeat at the hands of the Florentines, that somehow avenged the earlier defeat at Montaperti. And again, today we can't see, even normally in any kind of video, every single engagement that was occurring at the time, but remember, there is a lot of back and forth in that regard. You may not have battles of tens of thousands, in fact, in even at several years or even decades distance, but you have its equivalent being used over these years many times, with armies of hundreds of knights, thousands of infantry, looting, the enemy countryside, clashing with other enemy forces, besieging fortresses, and this was happening continuously. On top, remember, again, this is not just Florence versus Siena. There is Arezzo, there is Pisa, there is Prato, there is Lucca, etc. And as you know, I covered this series is part of just like the Florentine side of the story. I already covered the Pisan one, the Sienese one, the most important after Florence. And that's why also I'm taking all this time to explain Florence well, because it's such a privilege just to know its history in a historical perspective, meaning that the information that we have for this city is truly unique in the entire history of the world, and we know that much well. Like the Italian communities in general are much better known than practically any other place in Europe. Florence is the one we know best among them, so it's crazy, it's insane. And throughout the series we will explain better why that is the case, because also a new mentality, a new way of writing history, for example, of also preserving information and telling properly the story of a city. This is a huge deal, right? For the time, it's changing, it's being affirmed, right? In many ways, this is where, after, say, ancient Greece, that informed obviously our way of thinking, like modern thought was reborn in a way by the pen of Villani or Compagni. We're not talking about the same Dante. We want to, of course, go outside the strictly historiographical genre. Now, with the historical landscape of the peninsula altered, the commune of Florence, alongside the Angevin kingdom of Naples, emerged as a leading bastion of the Guelph faction in Europe. Remember, this is part of a huge system that stretches from the Channel to the Aegean Sea, right? You have France, you have Provence, you have Guelph, Italy, you have Naples, you have various Angevin possessions, French possessions in Greece. before the Vespers, Charles of Anjou is about to reconquer Constantinople. So we're talking here about the hegemonic system. I would like to stress the differences here. Again, I'm for the empire in many ways, but in a doctrinal way, in a traditional way. But I can't help to feel, say, sympathetic for Dante that also came from, as we've just observed today, like a context that, yes, was Ghibelline, but in traditional, but of course also proud of the independence of his city that he loved, arguably more above any other, of course, political reality in practice, in earthly terms. And it's as if, again, this was the new empire. This is obvious during the German interregnum, like the massive power here is the France of Louis IX. That's the true empire in Europe, that this enormous crescent, within which, however, the Italian communes are actually prosper. They are not brought again under this autocratic feudal hierarchy. They are sort of a huge commonwealth. It's been defined like this, historiographically speaking. And part of the reason is also, again, it's not that the Angevins were there to make charity to anyone, but they correctly understood that, first of all, like just having southern Italy in a strictly direct territorial sense was incredibly a huge deal. It was probably a different kingdom from France. Remember this, that Charles of Anjou was Charles of Provence in the way. He was actually a subject of the Holy Roman Empire when he conquered southern Italy. We want to be technical. But that, of course, reconquering Constantinople and ruling over Greece was really a much sort of more relevant deal for a Mediterranean power of that kind than trying simply to curb Italy as this massive system that was, albeit politically fragmented, actually very, very, as we've seen here, very homogeneous in many ways, and one that by that pressuring would have simply brought, as shown in the wars of the Lombard League, just to outrageous resistance, and also the possible reactivation of a Germanic power that these people were really not interested in. So it's really a very fascinating and overlooked time in European history. You can here see also like the Guelph ideology per se, which is instead the more controversial aspect of the story, because the Guelphs did not really have much of a real ideology. I mean, the Ghibelline one was the traditional one, and the Guelphs were not really denying that. As we've seen, just Dante lived by the same concept, so that he was a Ghibelline. So everybody was a Ghibelline to a degree. This was more like an international issue of determining who had to rule where and how, what were the limits of the empire, that had been settled in battle. So even just according to traditional doctrine, there was nothing to do about that. These Angevins had been better, in spite of all their schemes, etc. We've seen it at Tagliacozzo, but in many ways that was the way of war of the time, from many sides. So you can argue that there is this allegiance to both angelic and papal authorities in theory that is somehow expected to fulfill a historical role of sort, but you never find like a Guelph doctrine expounded by the degree of saying, okay, now we are actually Guelph, like we believe in this, we believe that the Pope must rule. Absolutely not. There is none of this historically. And in fact, it's also a bit difficult, in fact, to make the case that the decline of the empire was due to sort of a Guelph body of theory, like it was just like the failure of the same empire intended in a metaphysical sense. So everybody here was guilty of it, and yet at the same time there was something working, there was something producing power, and so something that you don't have to despise at all, especially if you're a traditionalist. There is, for example, the organization of veritable state. We already observed this for Florence and the other city-states in Italy that really become states at this point by strict definition. In Tuscany is at the center of, again, incredibly advanced civilizations, herself, of course, taken from the individual cities' perspectives. Naples, that was also, again, a huge power, like the French, the overall universal French role now, the peak of universalism of chivalry, of the great Gothic cathedrals, of the sense of sanctity, of order, of the rule. The same is true for the Papal Curia. The Papal Curia is overwhelmingly, as radically advanced at every single level that you can imagine, politically, administratively, legally, historically, like in a cultural sense. Let's not even talk the arts here. There's a video I made about exactly this, like the Italian, mostly Italian Trecento, but in that sense, Avignon, Naples, like Tuscany. So we're talking really the peak of medieval civilization on top of this concentrated in these areas. It's insane, right? Most of what you see as the grandeur, the top grandeur of Western civilization during the medieval millennium passes exactly through these places. For Florence, we don't even need to say that. Now, all this was achieved through two key aspects. The primacy of the city in Tuscany, of course, in a government backed by these enterprising organizations, culminating in a successful balance between the two dominant forces in Florentine history during the 13th century. The various political and social organisms were consolidating towards a more subtle hierarchical direction. An improvement towards these dual objectives occurred concurrently, by the way, although the development of Guelphism appeared fragmented in terms of internal politics and relations with other Tuscan cities. As we said before, this is not contemporary state. This is a fully traditional medieval community that essentially has so many universes contained within itself, right? Every organization finds its metaphysical place in the order. Clashes continue, however, within the system. This is important. You see it in Tuscany as you see it in the broader Italy. When Frederick II dies and most of the military, most of the resources previously destined to warfare are essentially liberated by the lack of this impression. That's the same are reinvested in warfare again against the other city-states. So this is the truth also for, say, the same wealth system, right? The cities, it would be extremely interesting, again, to make a even more in-depth history of what literally happened year by year. I could actually make it. Look, if you're really interested, we can get into that. And nobody knows that. I may be the only person on earth that truly is able to do this, and I'm not kidding you. If you have not understood, like, I'm a quite, unusual type, and so you may want to take note of that. Nevertheless, what I mean is that even within the Guelph system, if two cities are competing against one another, there is, of course, a general, pacification. The presence of Charles of Anjou, of his knights, those are all deterrent factors, because the Angevins also want everything to go smoothly. But of course there are going to be parts that are formed within the same parts. That's when the difference between white or black Guelph is born, right? What does that mean? It was essentially because you cannot, many people truly really think that Guelph and say white and black Guelph are sort of different version of what it means to be Guelph. It is in part even true if you project these these divisions on the actual subjects that you're looking at. But again, if the entire Guelph system did not really have a general doctrine, you can imagine what these subdivisions were. And what in particular most people do not really get is that especially white Guelph fundamentally equates to Ghibelline. It wasn't, again, like a different shade of Guelph in a sense of, if not by the fact that, as we've seen with Dante himself, there was a general Guelph hegemony and these people were fine to be in it as long as the city was fundamentally independent to some degree. But what you see in practice, what happens from a strictly political and military point of view, this is the case of Bologna, for example, that for a lot of years has a white Guelph regime, and that is also pretty hostile to black Guelph Florence. And is also a major pain in the behind because it's just across the Apennine, and so this say joint between this junction between northern and central Italy in the Guelph order is fractured, and this is a huge deal. Is really being a Ghibelline, right? These people would have not accepted Ghibellines, also considering that most of these were now becoming some sort of more autocratic powers of some sort. This is not so greatly pronounced yet in a strictly partitic fashion, but the idea that essentially the pressured Ghibellines would need a more autocratic power just to defend themselves and to survive from a military point of view eventually will generate, especially in northern Italy, where, as we've seen, this Saxo-Ghibellinism had remained, but also a greater seigneurial presence since the cooptations of Frederick II had remained, right, since the beginning, actually, of the 13th century, really brought to the process of seigneurialization of the Ghibelline world, right? Whereas cities like Florence or Bologna, after also reverted to black Guelphism, and so a complete alignment with the papacy, the Angevins, there was a very autonomous one, right? Also, but for the same Bolognese interests, they weren't telecommanded, let's say, to obey at all, especially Bologna across the Apennine, a completely different reality in many ways. Will stick to that more republican popular bias, even in terms of, for example, the organization of their armed forces. It's just by different degree, but essentially the Ghibelline lords will use more cavalry than the Guelphs, who preferred that sort of more old-fashioned, and this is also interesting, that actually more civic sense of say participation to the army from the individual citizens, that, however, with the general stagnation of the economy of the late 13th, beginning of 14th century, regression of the system globally wise, were becoming ever more fatigued and exhausted, and sort of ended up disintegrating or dismantling part of the civic reality and having also a tendency there towards autocratic powers. I think this is extremely relevant for today's times because we're somehow there, like that we have the idea that since liberalism has been prevalent in the West, so the most advanced and booming place, fighting against the West is a form of liberalism. So it's as if to say, in this context of late communal Italy, just fighting against this terrible Angevin French papal order was a way to actually do good, because there's this some strange principle that is expressed by the more zealotic sort of fringe part of the ideology, whereas most of the subjects of these places are actually very advanced, prosper, cultured, developed people who actually have, even as Dante proves, for example, a traditional inclination, like just the world at the time, and that therefore do not deserve to be equated to some sort of, again, the losers of the situation. A lot of Groypers that are sort of pushing this narrative, seeing every single kind of hint to traditional identity from the Ghibelline side as the absolute extreme that you could find in these realities, and as if the others did not believe in that, there was this kind of clash. No, it wasn't really like that. And in fact, these ideologies were relatively tenuous at the time. I mean, at least so much was going on, especially all these political divisions, that unless you actually know the history of all these city-states one by one, from an individual perspective, you know what was actually happening and who wrote what, like the entire chronicling production of the Italian communes of the time, you can't really understand. And this is, in fact, extremely frustrating from a historical point of view to popularize, to disclose on YouTube, because I understand that people do not even know what this all means. And so I try even to make as many videos as possible, even if they get less views, in order to make people understand how important this topic is, because there are so many parallelisms with today's reality. And then, of course, the Ghibelline traditionalists are very cool, and they were actually sponsoring that hardcore classical Roman Indo-European doctrine at levels that historiography has not found out yet. I'm actually working on a German mercenary myself. I will probably publish this in German, and it will not be open source. So I'm afraid. Well, okay, you can get the. I will not say who is going to publish it. It's as official, as straightforward as it can be, but you have no idea how much there is about this, and the entire ideology of this. I don't know, even just Ghibelline notaries writing chronicles and histories, etc. about these very, not just this. I mostly worked for about the early 14th century. So, the Swabians, there are lots of, again, Germans that are really very much there. But we will talk about this perhaps better in another bit. In fact, the one about the 14th century, I think I will have to do in 3 pieces at least. I was just preparing the script. Today, it's going to be insane. And these clashes are equally vicious. For the sake of simplicity, you understood that. There is sort of Guelph hegemony, but not everybody is Guelph at all. Like, there are some important strongholds of Ghibellinism, like Pisa, in the open Tuscan sun, right in front of everyone internationally. There is Arezzo, for example, is never very interland, sort of Apenninic power next to Florence, that is also irreducibly and sort of more traditionally Ghibelline, just even in lifestyle, and some sort of even Longobarд ascendancies and so on. We've seen these things, these classical legacies. We are in a pre-humanistic, but also proto-humanistic dimension. People are very interested in their origin, who founded the city, and they're also mixed altogether, but they still refer to that Catholic understanding of the universe, like determining in part such such systems. In 1280, making things extremely simple, a peace mediated by the Cardinal Latino Malabranca Orsini, a major Roman noble prelate, allowed many Ghibellines to return home. Right? This is done again for reasons of pacification, of consolidation, even in spite of all, but they're non-obvious, and we don't have all the time to digress on this. Some of these initiatives, by the way, were autonomous from the side of these powerful clergymen that came in arms, right, and had some very strong-fisted authority. So a world that, again, is very different from one that we stereotyped about the Middle Ages. You can argue that the shifting fortunes in Italy seemed to favor the Ghibellines once again, with the rise of the new Emperor Rudolf of Habsburg, and the consolidation of Ghibelline power in Romagna under the famed condottiere Guido da Montefeltro would also reform the Pisan militia, making it actually the finest force in Italy for a couple of generations. You have the Sicilian Vespers, major international deal. So Sicily rises against Charles of Anjou. The island was backed by the people there rebelled were backed by the Aragonese that land in Sicily, also by the Byzantines that, as we were saying before, were otherwise to be obliterated by the Angevins because they literally didn't have any mean to defend Constantinople had the Neapolitan forces invaded. So this is a huge deal, especially the crowning of, the new emperor is actually just king of the Romans, bear in mind, but Rudolf of Habsburg does not descend into Italy. He thinks about doing that 3 or 4 times. There were too many masses in Central Europe for being active in Italy as well. Things have radically changed in Germany. I talked about princely Germany a lot, explaining a bit what we're talking about as a whole. But the most important thing about the Habsburg the Habsburgic rise is that it's been wanted by the Pope, right? Rudolf of Habsburg was essentially elevated with papal support in Germany. And the reason is the aforementioned intolerance that the popes start having towards the same Angevins. They're becoming a bit too powerful. Especially in Germany, as you know, Charles of Anjou is allied with Ottokar of Bohemia, which is actually taking over great chunks of southeastern Germany. He even enters Italy itself in the Patriarchate of Aquileia and Friuli. Pordenone. There are very interesting intersections there, also with Eastern Europe up to Galicia, right through Hungary for the War of Babenberg succession. As you know, I wrote a master thesis back in the day on the Battle of Markfeld, so it's incredibly fascinating situation. And what Rudolf of Habsburg does, quite properly, is sending some help to the Italian Ghibellines at this point. And these are quite active. We talk about Guido da Montefeltro that causes in, I think it was either in Rimini or Ravenna, I don't remember. Forlì, excuse me, Romagna, a massacre of French knights within the city streets. He ambushed them, basically cut them to pieces, and that makes Romagna pass to the Ghibelline forces. This has major interferences with Tuscany because Arezzo, for example, is very connected with Romagna in the marches, and Guido da Montefeltro, they say that the Romagnols, also as mercenaries, could pass to Pisa by making the tour, like passing through Arezzo, in part with fortune through the Sienese one and reaching the Pisan district. So many of these little aspects. Rudolf of Habsburg at some point sends a couple of hundred of knights to Arezzo itself. Except there is a curious incident, because, of course, the Aretines were waiting for these forces. They would have been used against the St. Florence in that context. But these people are not German. They are what the Italians at this point call Burgundians. That is to say, essentially, it would be the Lorrainese, with the French speakers of the empire in the west. That, because they speak essentially French, sound too much Angevin for their too much Guelf for their tastes, and so these Aretines send away these otherwise fine knights just because they think they may side with them. And this tells you how, at this time, the dichotomy Ghibelline German, Guelf French was eradicated within these communes. Right, and then of course you have these different kinds, like the so-called Burgundians at some point also fight, in fact, in Ghibelline armies. When you say French, here you have to consider also Provençals, for example. Lots of Occitanians. At large, there are the Beau families, very famous in Paris. There's this nobility that distinguishes itself at this point in places of government, also as papal legates at a point. Like there is an incredibly rich history. And some things seem to be a bit rebalanced. You can't see here an actual Ghibelline victory, or like even just the Guelph system being particularly shattered. But it's definitely like a balance shifting towards the Ghibellines, threatening to alter the Guelph hegemony. So in Florence, the popolo capitalized on this situation, always in conflict with the nobility, instituting some constitutional changes between 1282 and 1284, without major upheaval, telling the truth, but reinforcing its position. Remember that the popolo will become de facto the regime in Florence in a broader sense. Right? These changes essentially included the establishment of a college of the 6 priors of the arts. So again, the arts are always the guilds. One for each district, because Florence was divided in sestieri at the time. So, as you know, so these cloves of urban organization that correspond also to the various local, say, militia organization units that had the same parishes. There was a lot of factionalism stemming even from these neighborhoods sort of competition. Remember that everybody here leaves. Again, there are the noble men, then there are the people, we could say. Sometimes all the same places, different houses, different clans, right? This constitution also entailed the election of a gonfaloniere from the same arcs. This was essentially an ensign, a standard bearer fundamentally, that sort of doubled on, again, this popular militia sort of organization, identity, morale boost, and so on. The formation of a council, further armed units, and the inclusion of their representatives in the council of the podestà, that, remember, is still the current ruler, like, of the city, right? Whoever he is, the post is alternated, and they came mostly, again, from other parts of Italy. We've seen that also Charlemagne became that, honorably speaking, but again, this is a republican regime. It works in that way, and the podestà was present all over the Italian communes. Now, this constitution essentially further strengthened the voices of professional organizations that had increased throughout all this general welfare within the Angevin hegemony. In fact, this had occurred with the backing of certain Guelph houses, entrepreneurs, bankers, and this seemed to stabilize further the base of the system, like preventing especially major coups at the top. Because if this basis was strong, like, it was more likely for it to stop any kind of autocratic experiment. Remember, the magnates are still there. They rule together with the other citizens. So it's not like this was a government, say, of the shoemakers at all, right? There is an increasing reinforcement of the establishment, and this through the statalization of the system, also in part the aristocratization of certain echelons, right? Especially from the arts side, which were the guys who sponsor, in fact, these common citizen, organizations from the standpoint of their general mercantile interest, from the fact that they feared that the noblemen, the military elite, could simply, dictate a seigneurial rule at some point. Meanwhile, the rival city of Pisa suffered the famous defeat at the hands of Genoa at the Meloria, just off the same Pisa that was on the coast at the time. We are in 1284. Some people think, because they still read, I don't know what, that, I don't know, 1284, okay, so Genoa knocks out Pisa. We don't know, we cross out Pisa from the history book. Pisa remains one of the greatest powers in Italy for generations, and soundly defeats Florence in open field multiple times, with the finest army of the era, right? So, again, naval power is another story. Indeed, the Pisans at that point actually they start following the Genoese, because they had not been completely obliterated, but now the Genoese were essentially able to oust the Pisans as major rivals, and these began to invest paradoxically into the Genoese markets as well, the Tyrrhenian. And so, even though we've seen it in the videos about Pisa, that Florence would ultimately conquer the same city in 1406, there is really a lot in between happening, and Pisa is very far from actually even ending anything. It's mostly like one of the major blows. It's also the loss of Sardinia in 1325 at the ends of the Aragonese, but it's still not even at that point that the city is actually falling or becoming less effective, especially from its constitution was very good, but this is also reflected by its armies that kept that strain. Now, the defeat of Pisa and the victory of Genoa at sea, however, brought substantial benefits to the Guelph allies on the mainland, right? Also because this enormous Florence needed ever more a safer maritime axis that normally she reached at this point through Siena. That has actually become Guelf and is now aligning, in fact, with the entire axis, and also in this case, like following mostly the Florentine trail. Siena, we saw that city as well in a couple of videos. It's an incredibly disciplined and tidy system at this point, and has a very considerate policy, very good mean of sort of internal control of the various factions. Again, great city. We'll have to come back on at some point. Now, there is another major chapter in Florentine military history, that is the Battle of Campaldino. I should make a video about this. This was fought famously on June the 11th, 1289. And it was a clamorous Guelf victory over the Aretinians, the Aretines. This is a major victory, probably in Florence, right, for the communal pride. Basically, if I'm not wrong, Compagni's Chronicle begins even with this battle. It's really the major turning point for which also Villani, another chronicler, starts really narrating, say, Florentine history in much greater detail. It's really the opening of Florence to a next stage, like of her Tuscan expansionism. Like in hindsight, this was knocking out a major rival. It wasn't conquered until like a few decades later. It was always like a Florentine senior was established, but Arezzo at least starts becoming ever more marginal in the Tuscan game of power. Still, it's still relevant, right? But Florence has become, just by size in comparison, too strong. In fact, the Battle of Campaldino is a majorly important military engagement. It's one of the few, in fact, Italian communal battles that you can read on the sort of Anglo-American wargamistic resumes about great battles in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, the main reason why this battle is known, actually, not unfortunately, I mean, thank God that we remember battles and anything historical to begin with, and this is especially an important one you may really want to remember, is the obvious fact that Dante participated into it, and just with an important role, because apparently, I'm not going to make the story of the historiography that is extremely complicated, but he essentially fought among the Feditori, that were the elite spearheading cavalry, opening the engagement at the head of the main battle lines, and we risked Dante there because the Florentine Feditori at the beginning of the battle are overwhelmed, are taken out, basically crushed by the Aretinian ones. And so Dante really, risked his life there, and the world, like, losing such an enormous vision of the world through this man. But just for telling you which these people came from, you would imagine Dante just like a poet or someone, the word of literature, the intellectuals that talk about Dante and understand so much about the context, yes, because they know better. And sometimes they don't even know that he was a knight himself, that his education, his traditional views were not the fruit of some sort of strange romanticism of his time. It's actually stemming from the blood and soil of Tuscany, of things like, I don't know, crude oil on a slice of bread eaten by his... And even this more material aspects are fascinating. There is obviously an immense historical, literary, artistic background to this all. But Dante has also a pretty mysterious life. We can only reconstruct, because he wasn't bragging too much about it after all. We know it through other sources that he fought on these occasions. It was one of those Florentine exiles, as you know, that would in fact fight even in places. For example, he went over to Arezzo when he was exiled, right? He fought together with the Ghibellines there against the same Florence. So there are lots of very beautiful pages there, even before his more famous hosting at Cangrande's court at Verona. The Battle of Campaldino is so important in this international order because it may seem just like a provincial battle, at most a regional one, but it really allowed the Guelphs to regain strength given the general political climate. This crushing victory over the Ghibellines is really remarkable. But it also provides the Guelph aristocracy, or the magnates, an opportunity to assert their significance through military prowess, contrasting with the popular faction represented by the rising entrepreneurial bourgeoisie. This is an incredibly important aspect in Florentine history and historiography because the aforementioned sources talking about the battle were normally black Guelphs from the popular side. We're talking Compagni, Villani, etc. Especially the former was... Villani was a kid at the time of the battle. Dante was in his youth, right? He was an adult man, but a pretty young one as well. Compagni was instead one of the priori of Florence, exactly in 1289 during the battle. There were lots of other engagements. We know Dante participated to the siege of the castle of Caprona against the Pisans far in the west. At this point, again, the Florentines have a pretty good sizable force. So this is a moment of major spurt of Florentine power that starts spiraling in scale. The same one on Milan, even surpassing with multiple armies at a time during a campaign. It's on different fronts at a time. It's really intense, right? It's the peak of military capacity of Florence. In fact, the Battle of Campaldino is this proof. Like to tell it all, the Aretinians were much less than the Florentines, especially in in absolute terms, but also and especially in cavalry. That was the decisive arm, but they were almost able to break through the Florentine lines, actually showing that, remember, right, in traditionalism of the Ghibellines that often manifested also in this greater warlikeness and military quality. Campaldino, telling the truth, has the greatest numerical disproportion in the entire late communal history. And if anything, there is a great deal of combined arms. The popular historiography emphasized the role of infantry, for which perhaps we think that sort of more things than have been as hypothesized were going on with these quite synergic Italian tactics that yes were so, and Campaldino is actually also a very good example of that, but because this was appearing pretty much everywhere. It's not just because of Florence. Actually, there are interesting studies coming up regarding this. Even the Romagnol communes that were much less developed had these coalition armies that enacted the same, or even actually more advanced tactics, because for Campaldino we apparently have just one battle line. Probably there were more. At least there were the Territorial were this primary battle line, then the sort of called Schiera Grossa, as they called it, the Great Line, that are the only ones we see. But if you are familiar with these chronicles, you also know that they tend to just focus on the fundamentals, and maybe we don't tell you that there is another line. Right? We know that from other battles, from other chronicles. When you cross-reference them, you realize one says there were 3 lines, other 2, things like that. The times were even 4, and the Romagnols, for example, would have been sort of less developed than this mighty Florence, still have the same, actually a 4 battle lines formation. We're talking cavalry lines plus infantry, normally on the flanks. That is something that at least we do not get for Florence until 1325, but that likely was the norm. Again, we don't get it documented, and there wasn't even the chance just to simply enact that. The norm was 3. However, the point of this battle is actually still the centrality of heavy cavalry. This is the case for the Italian communes at large. These have, again, literally the strongest infantry in Europe, but by political and social balance, this infantry does not need to counter cavalry within the same system, because as we've seen, just like in Florence, there is the popolo, but there are also the magnates. That in this case, as we just said, basically show off. Corso Donati basically saves the day for Florence with a flank attack on the on the Aretine flanks. He was, by the way, podesta of Pistoia at that time. He had also Lucchese forces under him. This gives you the dimension of the Tuscan-wide relevance of these clashes. I will surely make a video about the Battle of Campaldino because it's, again, one of the single most important and relevant in historical perspective, but in general it's relevant to look at things in a sort of more perspective sense. This battle solidified Florence's dominance over, say, the upper Arno Valley, and so it's not like Arezzo falls immediately at all. Like, it goes on for a generation or so independently. But again, it's sort of ever more, lost in the Apenninic hinterland, while the main issues that happen in Tuscany are, in fact, precluded basically to this force. They've never really been immense to tell it all, but still, you see, at this point could counter Florence. Campaldino, again, is the greatest moment of glory. Everybody celebrates that. It's basically the only victory that Florence manages to score at this point over, by the way, this weaker rival, and it was a closely fought battle. So Corso Donati was a magnate, and so the battle proved that this estate was an effective military force, as they had been born for being. Major knightly chivalric culture, and this great Corso Donati was known as the Baron by the Florentines. It's a bit like Farinata. They didn't like him, but at least the black, most popular Guelphs, etc., did not, like, they were pretty sort of distrustful towards him. But when he passed from the city, and I think this is Villani saying, he thought like the city was his own, like the Baron, right? You understand how much these people themselves admired men like him. And by the way, it's very interesting regarding the Guelph Ghibelline thing that there were voices about, Corso Donati having there also some shady dealings with Arezzo itself. Like, there are, in other Ghibelline forces, but you see, this was a time of Guelph hegemony in general for the city, for which, whatever the opinions of these people would have been, still they would have to play within that role. And even though Corso Donati, as we will see now, attempted a coup in Florence, it's not like he could simply say, okay, now I will declare myself a Ghibelline leader, I will wait for the emperor for, give me a feudal title. There was no chance whatsoever for that to happen anymore, right? This was not, Milan or Verona. This was another place, another culture, another world. And the same, you can think that the same Donati was, one would respect that to an extent. So it was just a seeking power, and how finding the right moment to obtain that. The magnates, in fact, all in all, regardless of their power, struggled to maintain influence in civic matters as the popular forces continued to gain momentum. And in the light of recent constitutional changes that favored these very forces, the magnates contemplated a resurgence of some sort of, it's either now or never. In fact, at least they could at least think to retake over individually. Following their victory at Campaldino, the people's demand for greater autonomy from the aristocracy became increasingly apparent. By December 1292, there is really a bit like the peak of Florentine popular power, and so also the anti-magnatic one, let's say, and the one of this, general popular constitution. A government sympathetic to popular ideologies was established and set to work on what would become Florence's most significant political document, the Ordinamenti di Giustizia, so the justice ordinances. Promulgated on January the 18th, 1293, these ordinances marked a clear departure from the past, aiming to curb the interference of powerful families referred to as magnates. The Ordinamenti di Giustizia created a class of magnates. Essentially, these were tagged, they were, listed in a way so that like we're watching you. So essentially, the constitution was establishing more popular forces, the capacity to check these people in the city streets. This is also the peak of Florentine military activity as a whole, like because the popular force, the popolo, paramilitary forces were some sort of militia operating within the city streets. Then, of course, all these Florentine citizens in general participated to the army was another thing, but it's interesting to see how this peak of popular force also corresponds to this balance, first of all, of civic, republican power within the city's institutions, and also with military activity abroad. Yet another proof that civilization goes in parallel with warfare, with citizen soldiers that conquer other sort of weaker systems that are also sort of more conservatively, autocratic. It's not to say that these don't decline. The former do not decline. In fact, we'll see how the St. Florence will become a signorate. That but I made an entire video on how essentially the rural aristocracy will take over essentially the communal system back to a degree. This urban houses still having that feudal ambitions still shape the time of the Italian lordships that fundamentally were run from that background. But now in even more robust states as monarchies, like political territorial reality is centered on the city and unavoidably urban in nature. Now, this list of magnates originally consisted of around 40 noble families, which grew to approximately 70 by an April registration, so you understand how often they updated that. The same government of the priori and the police was sort of crazy. It's as if, I don't know, you elect somebody for 2 months to be in charge. But that also tells you how close-knit all these people were as citizens and knowing what to do and how much the system actually worked, also in a time of major expansion. Yes, it is true that Florence was a bit exasperatedly regulated with such excessive checks and balances, but it still worked because the body politics was compact. And it was compact also in virtue, paradoxically, of these conflicts, because everybody worked to make things work and not to be left out of it. These magnates were, however, ostracized, right? They were completely excluded from holding political office. They weren't all the people of that class at all. In fact, these, as we've seen, continued to marry, say, in the arts families, for example, and there was a general power sharing, but some of them were considered too aggressive and too dangerous, and so they were banned, at least from holding political office, which didn't mean that they didn't have power, just they couldn't basically capitalize through that mean further that. And it's actually a huge deal because, of course, when a system becomes a state, you also start making a lot of money just by managing that, right? And so this actually triggers the magnates pretty much, right? The magnates, before this, at least, remember, there are always, now I said that there is a list of, discriminating against specific houses of the magnates, right? Otherwise, the magnates, there would be lots of other magnates that were not listed, for example, and they could, for this reason, for example, participate to the consulship of the arts. So these councils that accepted their presence as well, because they were still Florentine citizens, they would be chosen for their capacity and more. But there is a tense climate, as you understand, in the cities now. The Ordinamenti also established a division of the arts into 7 major and 14 minor groups that would fundamentally stabilize a great part of that guild establishment, requiring those wishing to enter political office to be registered in one of those groups. This is definitely an oligarchic tendency because you do not accept, it's a sort of block of the system from the top. So if you want to be part of the arts, you have to be part of the ones already existing. You can't simply enter newly with another one. So this is actually a major sign of statalization because this tells you how this was not really a popular, like, average commoner business, right? It was actually a major oligarchic mercantile and banking power, citing also a more nobiliar dimension as well, and gaining actually a power in that direction, because all the heads of these arts wanted to live as the magnates themselves, and actually they were part of the same business in many ways, given that, again, by law they had to contribute on the base of their census with a knightly panoply. They had to fight, and at this point there are also the cavallate instituted, there is a system a bit like the scutagium that allows essentially to send somebody else in your stead, paid by you, like to war, which also makes a lot of sense. This is also the moment effect in which mercenaries start being hired next to the cavallate. It, however, is also tendentially becoming some sort of elite citizen mounted force that's quite interesting. It's contained but actually effective. Wale famously studied this in some detail. You can check that out. Furthermore, the Ordinances called for the formation of a federation of the arts and the establishment of the Gonfaloniere di Giustizia, so a sort of justiciary, an office filled by the consuls of the arts entrusted with leading a civic guard of 1,000 men. That again, in the city streets means a lot, especially considering its infantry at large, and so it has major anti-nobiliar effectiveness to overthrow the system. Again, they're not crushing the noblemen, they're just disciplining them, which is in a relatively, like, again, 13th century Europe, a huge deal, right? In the city streets, not in open field. In open field, it's always cavalry that dictates the situation. This is incredibly important, and so never think this is a class struggle, that ideologically vicious extremization people tend to make when looking at this history, trying to project their own political conventional ideas on it. It has nothing to do with what you think it is. You're not born and raised in mid-13th century Florence, so you do not understand this at large. Like unless you have a very specific education of academic nature, do not hope to get there just with your means. You must study a lot before understanding this, and it's very complicated because even some of the most important scholarship does not have a great deal of an eventual comparative understanding of these topics, unfortunately, and what can you do? In any case, a significant figure during this time, to say the least, is Giano della Bella. Giano della Bella was a staunch enforcer of such ordinances, right? It was a sort of it's difficult to... Actually, they were quite authoritative men, but they were mostly from the sort of liberal side of the aisle, considering that, again, anti-magnate regulation. That's the only kind of parallelism you can approximately throw into just to conventionally explain what you're talking about. Giano's attitude was so rigorous that it soon alienated the magnate families. There are similar figures in other communes. We're not to draw parallelisms here, but again, the anti-magnate activity is peaking, especially in the Guelph world, in the more republican regimes, exactly at this point. And Florence is sort of the greatest example. Not the most, anti nobiliar system, right, of all. Like, there are other regimes that are very, very harsh, like especially in Emilia, for example. When there were also much less powerful noblemen than in Florence, considered that proportionally. And the reasons comparatively can't be explained. I made a video about Parma. You can check that out and compare. The more lenient approach of 1295 allowed some magnates to re-enter city governance, while Giano was exiled amid suspicions that he sought to become the Lord of Florence as well. So it was as a populistic autocrat. an exile that he suffered despite enjoying unconditional support from a significant portion of the populace, as noted by Dino Compagni, that was somehow sympathetic to him. And this exile symbolized a tacit agreement between the people and the Guelph aristocracy. Think about this. Remember, there is not just the social divide, but the factional, the partitic one, right? Also the factional one. But this is to say that the populace has strengthened itself to the point that it's actually shaking hands with the same nobility, as long as it's wealth, and so it basically allows for the Angevin hegemony to be there, for the main banking system to work within this, again, pretty continental scaled trade system, of which Florence was, especially from a financial point of view, at the center. So it's fine. Those magnates that align, that are fine with the populace being there, are welcome. And that's also why Giano della Bella, that was more intolerant of the magnates at large for more populistic reasons, is expelled from the city. The Guelph hegemony, again, was crucial for political alliances with the Pope, the King of France, the Angevins. There was a massive military help that Florence received, even though it was already, again, very powerful, like one of the greatest powers in Europe. And the reason why this was the case is that, again, there were across Tuscany also did these struggles, and also Ghibelline powers, and so powerful in their own way that, there was this sort of quasi-permanent warfare, and the Neapolitans, the Angevins, had always to send some 100 French knights, let's say, to stiffen the ranks of the Florentine effort. It was also mostly a matter of money. Like, it costs too much, you don't want to pay for it. So there are very interesting balances here, and you're playing with fire because shortcomings can be exploited by your adversaries. And as you understand, Florentine politics is at the peak of its efficiency, but it's for this reason still kind of unbalanced, allowing for such spaces of infiltration or weakening from the enemy side. Commerce and banking are always key to the sustaining of an effective military system. Now, the line between established wealth and newly gained fortune became increasingly blurred, particularly evident in the system that declared magnates based on popular input that sometimes included representatives from the populace itself. That's where properly the compaction of the regime had been established. Right? Ultimately, the distinction no longer rested on social status or lifestyle, as it had been, say, at the beginning of the century, but became primarily political. Anyone suspected of threatening the supremacy of the popolo in governance was deemed a magnate, so that by now Florence is a Guelph, black Guelph, largely popular government with, again, a podesta, or at times what would become de facto some lord in that function. And if you were not part of the system, you would be looked upon with suspicion, also in a reasonable way. That's why, again, as I said before, in this space there was no other way but to be a Guelph, right, to side with the general international system. So that Florentine politics mostly, because there wouldn't be any wavering, right? This is a very different time from the previous generation, say, of Montaperti or before, where really Florence could become Guelph or Ghibelline depending on the situation. Now it's just all Guelph, and there are no waverings, right? Throughout all the rest of the period, we will see it. In the early 14th century, so the peak property of Florentine absolute wealth, and in spite of all the defeats that Florence suffered, she is inoxidably black Guelph. There are very few other regimes in Italy that are just like this. And in any case, they are depending to some extent, at least on, or resting at least on, the black Guelphness of Florence, right? And it made a lot of sense. This is again also why Dante was a Guelph, but says, okay, but I'm white Guelph, so it means something else, that is to say, a slightly less French presence in the city. This is in fact the other issue that we will look better also at the beginning of the next video about the 14th century. That is to say, that further tension arose, excuse me, drink a little, from a split within the same Guelph party, dividing it into the Donati and the Cerchi factions. These were two houses of Florence, as we've seen, of some very fine, powerful noblemen. The Donati were the blacks, right, more closely aligned with the papacy and backed by the mercantile elite, but just more so. I mean, at some times, as we were saying before, they would even flirt with the Ghibellines, so this was just depending on the incredibly complicated balance within the system. It was very complex, very articulated, and so you can't generalize anyway. The Cerchi instead were the whites, were the moderates, right? And so people tended to say that Florence at least should have not been so much rigidly subjected to what exactly? Because again, Florence was getting nothing but advantage from this alignment with the Guelphs. But when in fact, the Guelph order, the international Guelph order, but the evidence was, say, for this kind of descent towards that order in principle is the fact that when these factions start becoming turbulent and start clashing against one another, because just the Donati and the Cerchi were part of that same nobility that would normally beat one another in that kind of mafia style of, confrontation in the city streets, etc. This engulfs the whole freaking system, also internationally. And so Charles of Valois, that is to say a burdensome envoy dispatched by the Pope, Boniface VIII, was sent to Florence to sort of falsely pacify, because this is how it was called, the Grand Paciere, that is to say the great peacemaker of some sort, culminates literally in the occupation. This was essentially a signory, a temporary signory, because there was no way to control Florence. Like, if you had just been too oppressive, as we've seen from the Angevin side, you would have caused an actual rebellion. And the Florentines were incredibly jealous of their own prerogatives. So again, the difference between the whites and the blacks within the Guelph party is incredibly nuanced, depending on who wanted to rule within the system and how. Not much because they had, in fact, anything against the idea that they weren't awaiting for the emperor secretly or in covert, because you could do that if you were Dante, say, gone to Verona. There was a completely different place, closer to Germany, and willing, like, balanced in a way that would render a Ghibelline regime available. When you would come back to Florence, you couldn't but be Guelph. It wasn't really an imposition. It's just that Florence, in the way she was positioned internationally up to that point, the wealth she had, the kind of role, the geographic position, was just fine with Guelphism, and it would remain so, right? So that there were clashes between the Guelphs, between the whites and the blacks. But at some point, they were also reconciliated, right? The arrival of Charles of Valois in Florence was, however, essentially the most violent imposition that you see in this context over not much the Florentines, but on the white Guelphs, culminating in their expulsion. And notoriously, among these whites, there was Dante Alighieri. Together with other notable figures, Dante had specifically allied with the Gherardini of Montagliari. Here, understanding all the clientele relations of these houses is a bit complicated, but just think that the same Dante had exiled his greatest friend, Guido Cavalcanti, who also died of malaria in exile. But Dante had an incredibly, as you know, solid idea of civic duty, etc. And it's a bit difficult again to explain that. If you're interested, again, there is the documentary made on Dante that explains this a bit better. But when you look at this context, you understand how naturally complicated it could be and how much ad personam it could get. In any case, the overthrowing of the white Guelphs makes, of course, Florence now a fully black Guelph system. And it's not like clashes are over. They're never over. But at least the general alignment is fully secured. Right? And many white Guelphs, of course, go abroad and they are supported by the Ghibellines, as we've seen. So there were other internal issues, as we were saying before. That is to say, the merchant oligarchy faced the opposition not only from the magnates but also from other guilds. The 5 median and 9 minor arts that, as we've seen, had been fully established from an institutional point of view among just the only ones that could exist in Florence. So imagine the grievances of the previous guys, and now, like the grievances of the latter, the minor arts that feel, compelled to take sides themselves. For example, this intensifies the conflict between the so-called popolo grasso, that are the wealthy citizens, literally means fat people, because they were that rich, and the popolo minuto, which means the small people of the lower echelon of the popolo, which again weren't just like, I don't know, the shoemakers, just making. There were people with considerable wealth, to say the least. Now, the turmoil did not cease with the whites' expulsion. The black faction further fractured into the Donateschi, led by Corso Donati, and the Tosinghi, supporters of Rosso della Tosa. These were other clans that, again, had always a good reason just to ride these turbulences and hope that this could lead them somewhere. You understand how you can sort of ideologically dilute certain issues, but you can't fundamentally simply control a city like Florence that had, it's part of a major factional struggle. Now it has hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. It's like a massive system. And you can't quite simply, enter there and dictate the rule. In fact, nobody really does. This is important to stress. Like, this is often the case in Italian history. People think that for all the dominations that Italy had from abroad, like, this consisted in people walking in and dictating the rule. It was never like that. It was always a negotiation between the locals in very opportunistic ways, and an enormous degree of autonomy there. So in this case, you don't even have even a foreign seigneury. We've seen Charles of Valois, because he arrived there with his knights and sort of imposed the situation. He was acclaimed in a triumphal way, but there were those aberrations, as we said before. But then he went away. And again, this all happened through the various councils, the podestà, like the entire government was still a pretty autonomous machine. So always remember specifically how these systems actually worked, which is difficult to do, because if it is, I presume, like the first time at least you listen to one of my videos about this topic, you say, but I've never heard anything about this. Yes, I know, but that's why I make videos, and I made many about Florence, by the way, by now. Now, there is an incident, by the way, that is very interesting, that is Corso Donati's assassination, right? He attempted a coup in Florence. He basically failed because he had to receive foreign, we mean other cities, support. Apparently this was an accusation that arrived too late. It was a urban battle. He lost, and he escaped. And he was chased by some Catalan or Catalan-style Florentine troops that killed him on the spot. Like, he was transfixed in the neck. Remember, Corso Donati was a war hero of Florence. He had won the battle of Campaldino for his beloved city. And he was killed just like that, because he wanted to essentially become the Lord of Florence. And this tells you also how serious the situation really was for men of this caliber to be able to think to take over, right? Naturally, the Donatis faction was expelled in a similar way because of this incident, couldn't pass, unpunished, which actually temporarily stabilized the situation in the city, right? So we will talk more and better about these crucial times at the beginning of the video about the 14th century. I would just like to point out for the 13th, in all this story, of course, how much Florence was giving to world civilization at this time, when the city entered a remarkable period of architectural development, among the others. For example, construction on churches progressed notably. The cladding of the baptistry showcased a significant advancement in Romanesque architecture, characterized by elements inspired by antiquity that would continue to evolve in subsequent centuries. Florence had a very classical, right, Roman-inspired art, mixed now with the Gothic, right, the Tuscan Gothic that is pioneered here. It is basically the surpassing of the Byzantine forms of the previous generations that were still informing Italian art, that, however, had already gone beyond the Byzantine one by itself, and affirming this most beautiful, peculiar style that you don't really find elsewhere, because basically, like all the rest of Europe has the Northern Gothic that had born conceptually in England, had developed out in France, and so there is much of that. Also, I don't know, the Cathedral of Milan is very much like reminiscent of that. Let's say Spain, for example, is it has arabesque motifs, but it's fundamentally that Northern Gothic as well, by Frankish influence. And Italy has this Italian Gothic, which is very much extraordinary within itself, is also much more, let's say, it's really different. You can say is more sophisticated. It's just like the Italian version, what the Gothic sophistication would be. Think about the Baptistery of Pisa, just to make an example. Look at the facade of the Orvieto Cathedral, the Sienese Cathedral. I mean, we're talking about some of the greatest landmarks in the history of mankind. Now, the most remarkable achievements during this era in Florence included the rapid development of major works, such as the new city wall. This was a huge deal because this, I think, was the fourth one, which is insane because of the size of the city, of course, but also just how much could be spent. Most of these works were not started to be finished even at a certain point. It would take, in fact, this long, like 50 years to finish. The important was having this opening, this open working site that would absorb so much costs just for all the people who came working in Florence and paying, developing the city further. We will see how, for example, when Henry VII besieged Florence in 1312, the city was the outer city wall. This was not finished yet. There are still traces of parts of this still intact. Again, with the Renaissance, some of these fortifications became obsolete, but they were still immense by infrastructural standards at the time. And this is true at so many levels of also Florentine military engineering, and there are so many things we could discuss, but again, unfortunately, we don't have time. We'll make other videos. I have one in store about exactly this Italian city rings that are a bit like we think of all the great fortifications in the world, military history, but for some reason that military bias hasn't attached to the idea that people have about the Italian communes, which is incredibly depressing given that we're essentially the most advanced of the era. Then you have, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, commenced in 1296. The Priori Palace began in 1298. These are, I don't know, that I think most countries in the world are not worth the single buildings. I don't even have to describe them. We have, again, 100,000 inhabitants. This is a medieval metropolis. And these massive stone structures, their style, their efficiency, their effectiveness, some of these, like the Priori Palace, as you see, is a castle within the city. It's a palace, but also a castle, which was really typical of the time. You see, in fact, all over the city, these buildings emerging also privately, we will see now. A key figure, naturally, in Florentine, and not just like in the broader Italian art, was Arnolfo di Cambio, who also advanced monumental sculpture, having learned from his master Nicola Pisano. Arnolfo made famous, he made so many great works, but he also made a statue, famously enough, preserved at the Roman National Museums of Charles of Anjou. We're talking a completely different way of seeing the world, a truly transfigured one through the same scholastics, the same universalism, the same papal French influence and hegemony. For not talking here about the advancements in literature, think about the poets of the Dolce Stil Novo, all people again that you would just read about from Marxist history of literature that is not war, right? It's not politics or evil power. All these poets were knights. They killed people for a living, right? You have Folgore da San Gimignano, you have, there are, of course, the same Dante would experiment in that, but Ceccongiolieri, like you have, again, some figures that you have never, the same Guido Cavalcanti, if you have never heard of, like, I'm extremely sorry for you. Just at your personal, moral, and cultural background, if you can so describe it. Again, there are not many ways you can be Europeans. This is definitely one of them. It's a necessary passage. Like, to be a Westerner to begin with, you can't say this is not something I don't want to learn because I've never heard of, or my country has never been interested in this. It's a grave deficit in civilizational level by all standards. Like, you can't avoid this stuff. And I will surely make some videos about the Dolce Stil Novo. Now I'm actually exhausted and speaking from hours. I managed actually to finish the 13th century. It feels incredible. But what I really mean is that, of course, in this same literary style that is influenced, as you know, by the Sicilian school of poetry, that is in turn influenced by the Occitanian one and so on, there is that literally humanistic reveal that you see in Dante, that you see in this beautiful art, the use of vernacular, the fact that this humanity could now be elevated to greater heights. You have parallels in European, other countries' art, and at the same time, the 13th century is really that peak of the great medieval civilization. You have Cimabue and his student Giotto that are the forefront of renewing Byzantine painting, laying the foundation for a new artistic style. Florence thrived in creativity and displayed its wealth through art and grandeur. Magnificent palaces belonging to the Spini, the Frescobaldi, and the Gianfigliazzi are still present, like newly constructed churches such as Santa Trinita, Santa Croce, Santa Maria Novella, Santa Maria degli Angeli, and the 3 new bridges spanning the Arno. Again, it's practically impossible to resume everything on the same basis you would do with another topic. This is the reason why I thought that today I couldn't even finish this. However, considering what we're specifically talking about, this is not just some strange story, some strange context. This is basically the most important thing in this part of medieval history, and this is also, I would say, the measure of how much you can appreciate the same Western civilization. Like, if you don't know this, as I said, there's no way around it. There's no way you can simply fix the equation and say, well, I didn't really know, or I don't really care. It's something that I can't simply come to dominate. This simply must be known. And in any case, it has such traditional meaning. I mean, if we talk about Giotto, like the way, the same metaphysical, the same theological principles are represented from an artistic point of view. The attention to this transfigured humanity, the sense that the same art brings these archetypal figures to life itself on campus. It's, I would think, one of the single most relevant aspect of the entire system. Dolce Stil Novo, the angel-like woman that is basically the transfigured victory and Holy Ghost itself, the mere beauty and appreciation of life, right? It's great. Capacity to see universal values through the affirmation of these representations. There is a lot of still Byzantine influence in gold, in some of the styles of representation, but we're also looking at, think about Duccio da Buoninsegna, the Maestàs, the re-evaluation, in fact, of the of woman glory in helping, like the knight, the hero that is chasing. Like, this is also what Dante is with Beatrice, after all. It's this sense of self-actualization through the highest, most noble of the enterprise, let's say, the feelings. And there is something celestial about it all, that if you haven't really grasped, like, in a basic education, it's a bit difficult just to resume in a bit of that ending that I wasn't even programming to expand to these details. So it's incredibly difficult to describe this at a just speaking of these all these enormous topics. I even lack the words for them. Just at the end of a video that is much more politically focused, right, and artistically or in other, say, in another direction oriented. But I hope that at least that basic information regarding the period, the age, can really appear more clearly, that there is something that sort of makes sense with what we presented. Towards the end of this video, if you hear me clicking here and there, it's because I'm actually getting, like, after I make the video, think about all the things that I may have forgotten to insert in the actual images, and I sort of refresh even just when I make the video, and again, couldn't even stop really finding exactly the right balance, right, of information regarding this content. Nevertheless, I for today stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.